Hello again, this is Jay McCluskey, and I am delighted that you have joined us today for what is the last of our series of lessons on good women in God's Word. We have had 25 lessons altogether here. I hope they've been meaningful to you. I know the journey has been especially good to me. And we finish on a very positive and warm note, I think, as we talk about the role of ladies within the context of the family. I brought with me today a picture of me and my mom that we took on one of our trips together some years back, not too far, and I keep this photograph near my study. I can see it often, how endearing a lady she remains to me. And we see today that this family context was endearing and beneficial to Timothy as he was one of the early leaders in the New Testament church. I hope you have your listening guide with you that you could download from our church website. And at the very top, you will see the opening to a familiar line in poetry to many folks. William Ross Wallace, published there in 1865, who said, "The hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world." It was that poet's way of appreciating and emphasizing the impact and influence that mothers had upon the children who eventually were those who were in positions of power and such. That is actually the refrain of a poem that had numerous verses to it. I was able to look it up, and one particular verse I liked, and I also put that on your listening guide. Look as I read it to you. "Women, how divine your mission here upon our natal sod. Keep, oh, keep the young heart open, always to the breath of God." The divine mission that you have. How divine your mission, motherhood, and then grandmotherhood to follow that we see here in Lois and Eunice. And here are these ladies who rocked the cradle, if you would, for Timothy's life when he was young and helped him become the strong Christian leader he was in the New Testament church. Truth is, we don't know much about them, but what we do know about them makes us respect and praise them a lot. Some years ago, I got to watching a television show in the summer. It was on weekly on the Golf Channel. And I really don't watch a lot of the Golf Channel unless it's showing some live golf I'm interested in. But somehow I landed and understood that this was a show where they were trying to correct the golf swing of a former NBA basketball player named Charles Barkley. He's a well-known retired athlete and still does basketball commentary. And if you're familiar with golf and Charles Barkley, his golf swing was herky-jerky. He would stop halfway down his swing and back up and try to hit it again, and it was just awful, and it was a disaster, and he desperately wanted it better, so they do this TV show around him for getting lessons. And the teacher he had was a man named Hank Haney, one of the greatest, most renowned golf instructors in the world. He instructed Tiger Woods for a while in Tiger's career. And so it was kind of fun to watch as he would try and work with Charles Barkley to hit the ball smoothly and hit it straight and overcome all of the impulsive that were hurting his game. And inevitably, when Charles Barkley would hit a bad shot, and that happened often enough, maybe just so he wouldn't curse, he would say a phrase over and over again, and it was hilarious just to hear him say it. He would say, "God bless my mother. God bless my mama." And that's kind of a theme we have here coming out of this study of Lois and Eunice, that God bless them for the role that they played. I put a map with your outline. I hope that you can pull that up and look at it. We've had several maps here since we've been looking at Paul's journeys and where he was and such in these last bits. But I want you to notice that Antioch is the place where both Paul's first and second missionary journeys take place. And the first missionary journey, as I call it, an out and back journey. So it goes down to the island of Crete and then up in here into modern day Turkey and eventually over to some series of towns here in Lystra, Derbe, and Iconium. Lystra is where we meet on Paul's second missionary journey. The characters of of Timothy and a first reference to his family, to his mother in particularly. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a man named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along in the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So it's primarily about Timothy at this point in Lystra, but I wanted you to see that on the map, on both Paul's first and second missionary journeys, he went to Lystra. On the first missionary journey, and he can give you text of this, it's in Acts chapter 14, things initially go pretty well in Lystra, but then there's some critics that come in. There's some misunderstanding. Paul and Silas heal a crippled man, and the people say, the gods have come down to visit us. And they call Barnabas, who was with Paul on that trip, they call him Zeus, and they call Paul Hermes because he was the spokesperson, and they kind of have to play that down. And then criticism arises and wins over the crowd in time. And Paul a lot of us know this happens, but just to remind you, this is where it happened in Lystra. Paul was stoned, drug out of the city, and left for dead. That he would go back on his second missionary to that city is an amazing thing in and of itself. And there on the second time around is where we see Timothy. We see him becoming part of Paul's missionary team at that point. The circumcision that he takes upon for Timothy to experience is so that they will be well accepted in the Jewish communities that they will go about. And we don't know, it doesn't say it in the Bible, but it does say that Paul's mother was a believer, Timothy's mother was a believer, and perhaps it was on or because of Paul and Barnabas's first missionary journey that when Paul goes back with Silas on his second missionary journey, that here is a candidate for greater work in ministry. So we don't know that for sure, but it could certainly be the case that it was through Paul directly or indirectly that his family become Christians. I want to share with you a few things. I call Lois and Eunice, passing the faith along because it runs through their family and characteristically grandparents and parents and then the children of some important things. We'll dwell a lot on the first one and a little less time on the last two. So follow along with me. The first one is the calling to pass along the faith is to the family. It's family that is the seedbed for new believers. It is the ideal place, and it's by God's design. I give you a verse there from the book of Deuteronomy. You might be familiar with it. It says in Deuteronomy 11, fix these words of mine on your hearts and minds, tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. It is in the home. It is that parent responsibility that you should not delegate to anyone or anything else, even the church. The church cannot be a sufficient substitute for the spiritual education that by God's design should take place in the home. I just crunched a few numbers about the math of sorts. A school-age child would spend about 35 hours a week in school, 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. And then the time at home, let's say 8 conscious hours. And then on the weekend, 16 conscious hours. That up to 72 hours under the direct influence of the home. Now, you might also be involved as a family or a child in extracurricular activities like dance or like sports or something else that could take 2 or 3 hours a week into that. Now, how much time do you have for the church directly? An hour, 2 hours, 3, 4? That would be really at the high end. And so there's just not the time for the church to do it all. And what our role is to be a supplement, a complement, to help. And so I'm going to give you put a list here, a headline as how the church can help. And I'm going to talk about some of the things I see as the church's way to work hand in hand with the calling of the home to teach spiritual education to our children. First, the church can teach and reinforce biblical principles. Because if our children and our grandchildren don't learn them at home, in our society today, where are they going to learn them? Where are they going to learn about a system of relating to people that is entirely based upon grace and see the world through the eyes of grace instead of the eyes of merit? Where are they going to learn about the sanctity of marriage? Where are they going to learn about decency? Where are they going to learn about humility, if not in the church and also primarily in the home, but to get the backup message from the church? Second, show discipleship is a lifelong process. That it's not something just, like for children or for a little window in your time, but mature Christians are like watching this video, trying to complete their faith to a greater new level. And our kids see that, they know that, they experience it, and they be with you, alongside of you at the same time. If everybody's going to, let's say, Sunday school classes together, that teaches an important message that this discipleship relationship with Jesus is one that is a long-term in all the days of this life. Next, demonstrate a more ideal community. There's lots of organizations out there in the world, aren't there? There's schools, and there's businesses, and there's recreation groups, and there's just all kinds of organizations. But the church is very, very unique. Kind of like a business, we have a budget and we hire employees, but we're not a business in that sense. We're like a school, that there is education that takes place, but we're not a school. We're like a theater in some ways, that people gather in a large building with a platform experiencing worship, but we're not a theater. We are our own special kind of entity where grace lives and is shared, and love and respect and fellowship. The relationships of the church is supposed to be reflective of what heaven is like. It's an imperfect reflection, true enough, but should show that the relationships that are in other places that are less than grace-based, I'll put it that way, is not the way it has to be. It's not the way God designed it to be. And so there's this really cool volunteer organization called the Church of Jesus Christ, which is a wonderful community to be a part of, that teaches unconditional love and grace and forgiveness and second chances and humility, and really great virtues there in living it out in our community. As related to that, number 4, provide quality mentors and examples. Now, we hope the first mentor and example for any young life would be the parents or grandparents, as we find with Lois and Eunice to Timothy. But it's great. You can't have too many of these. I am grateful, and when I was reflecting on this, of people in my formative years, men who showed by example what a Christian gentleman was like, what Christian life could be lived like in strength and in grace and in kindness and in ministry. A lot of the fathers of my friends were good Christian men. I was graced that not only, I said to my friends, we not only had great Christian fathers, our friends had great Christian fathers. And so we saw the influence of a Walt Hodge, who was my friend Rocky Hodge's father, and he's gone to be with the Lord, but Walt was just a great and faithful man. Or Harold Perrin, another man's been home with the Lord for a couple of years, and my friend Tim had him as his father. Godly man, a little quiet, very humble, but just loved Jesus and wanted his family to love Jesus. The list could go on and on for me. R.B. Burnett, Jack Easterday, whose funeral I attended not too many weeks ago, because he was such a dear part of who I am and always has been. And then Mr. Tom Mullins, who's going to celebrate his 102nd birthday this summer. I hope I can wish him a happy birthday in person. Just these were names, and they just represent the scores of folks who are great examples. I know you can come up with your own list, and we just can't put too many good examples in front of our children of mature Christianity. And next, then, be an extended family. Families who you reach out to in difficulties and troubled times. I'll say it this way. I have a brother and I have 2 sisters. I love them dearly. If they live closer, I would ask them for a lot more favors. If I needed a truck and one of them had a truck, I'd say, hey, can I borrow your truck? That's who I'd ask. They're not here. They live hundreds of miles away. What do? I have to go to one of my brothers or sisters in the church and say, hey, can I borrow your truck? those folks who live close by, who will rally around, who will be there. How many times have I heard it? How many times have people like you said it? If it weren't for my Christian family, I don't know how I would made it through this hard time. Or a similar statement, I don't see how people get through life, or difficulties, or grief, or disappointment without their Christian family, and I don't either. We need the extended family to us. Now, let me pause here and say, as you try to do these things, in the home's responsibility as parents and as grandparents, providing a good spiritual environment, good examples, having them in church and things like that. You can do all right and good things, and at times, even kids raised in quality, mature Christian parents walk away from their faith, and it's not an active thing in their life. But you can take that responsibility and see to it that they know about the Lord as they get to the point where they make those decisions for themselves. Because if you don't take that responsibility, who will? Someone will try to delegate it to the children themselves and say things like, this makes me cringe when I hear it. Well, I'm just going to let them decide about faith, about religion, about God. I'm just going to let them decide for themselves and try not to influence them. And my comeback is always, are you going to let them decide to brush their teeth or not, just themselves? If you think something is healthy and worthwhile, you want to make sure it's in your child's life. And so faith in the Lord is something you think is genuinely really worthwhile, then you want your children exposed to that as you think it has benefited you and would be able to benefit them. I have seen at times when people are not as spiritually mature as their parents, and then when they raise kids, their kids aren't spiritually mature as them, and it can kind of create a downward cycle of things because of a lack of priority, a lack of a lessening of exposure. Miss Ella teaches our daycare in the pre-K class. She does a great job. Miss Ella is Romanian by birth. And at 8 years old, she was adopted by a family here in the United States, and that's how she got here, and we value her a lot. And I approached her, and I can't remember exactly why, but I had a question, and I said, how do you say this word in Romanian? Knowing she was born there and lived in some early years, she goes, I don't know. I don't know the language anymore. And she followed up. She just wasn't, she knew it when she was 8. She spoke it fluently for an 8-year-old. But without any practice and exposure to it, it declined. And I'm pretty sure when Miss Ella has her own children, they're not going to speak Romanian because their mother, less, and just the generations has declined. Well, apply that principle to spirituality. And so that's why it needs to be a priority to us to keep that fire burning within ourselves and opportunity for them. I said a little word at the graduation of our 4-year-olds in our childcare who are going into kindergarten this year. It's Miss Ella's class. And I brought with me a jar of pennies. I said this is the McCluskey Scholarship, and I gave it to at random. We picked one of the children in that group to their family. And so I got a jar of pennies. There were 520 pennies in the jar. I said that represents 1 penny for a week, each week for the next 10 years. And I said, every week you take a penny out and you put it away. And if you haven't, think about it, if you haven't had prayer with your kids or prayed for them, if you haven't let them exposed to Bible story, if you haven't had them in church in a time, you take that out and you can't put it back. That's the way time works. You can't put it back. You can't go back and redeem it. It's something that is lost. These are precious years, and take advantage of them was my appeal to them, especially if you want a child to be raised in the care and nurture of the Lord. In this section, I say, beware of the possibility that prioritizing discipleship in the home can become too little too late. Maybe it's when a crisis takes place or when there's trouble of some sort or whatever, and your children are in their early teens or something. We're going to start going to church. I hope deep roots get established very quickly and fruitfully. But I also know, boy, it can be so late to get into the game. And a lot of those foundational things are already set that begin even in our preschool days. So again, that responsibility that falls back to the home. Well, I said that's what I would talk about the most. Let's go on to the next two things we can see from Lois and Eunice. The circumstances can be less than ideal, because go back to where it says that Paul is in Lystra, second missionary journey, came to Derbe, then to Lystra, where the disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The easiest interpretation there is that Timothy's father was not a believer. He was not a Christian. And so the Christian spiritual leadership fell to his mother with the also help of his grandmother. And frankly, this tends to be the way that I have seen it in church throughout my life and throughout my vocational life here in our church. Far more often than not, there is a godly Christian lady who gets up and gets the kids up and gets in the church, and the husband stays at home. It's just not as important to him to participate and be part of that. That's not ideal. Ideally, there's an equal partnership and responsibility between husband and wife, mother and father, that is shared together and experienced in leading the children in church participation and in their spiritual development. But as we know, that's sometimes less than ideal takes place. I remember a friend of mine who I had growing up, and I roomed with him in college for a little while, but he would say, I'm a Christian and a believer today because my mother got me up every Sunday morning, every time the church was open, made sure I was dressed and out the door with her and brought me. And his father didn't care, at least that time. Later, his father became a follower of Jesus, and it was a great time. But in those formative years, the mother took all the responsibility. So if you are, or if you know somebody in a situation like that, I hope you will find encouragement that in this story, one of the great leaders of the New Testament came out of that kind of context. And just to take comfort that God is still fitting quality influences to help young lives become godly adults, even in circumstances like we would say here was less than ideal. Last thing, faith is caught more than it's taught. Yeah, there are the lessons that go, but when I caught, I mean more about the example that you live out in front of them. When we get to 2 Timothy, Paul's last written letter in the New Testament, he says, I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded lives in you also. The apple didn't fall far from the spiritual tree. Same quality of faith that was in Lois and then in Eunice also fell to Timothy. That is not an absolute rule, but it sure is a general rule that takes place. As they had, and I like that word there, it had sincere faith. The King James Version says unfeigned faith. The word I want you to fill in is the word genuine. Almost all the translations that I looked up to find how that word had been treated by the translators use the word genuine, though the literal standard version says unhypocritical. And it's true and true on weekdays as well as Sundays in all circumstances, family and otherwise. Genuineness, sincerity of the faith shows through. I know this about children. I know this, your children can detect a phony. And if your spirituality is just all show and it's not deep, and if you relate things one way in one context and a different, it kind of reflects Jesus. If you're spiritual to the church crowd, but you're a different person at home, they'll detect that. So and catch up on that, and it will make an impact on the kind of Christian that they want to be. You want to be genuine as you possibly can be. Recently, a friend of mine loaned me a DVD of season 4 of the Andy Griffith Show. That's just good for the heart when you want to get away and watch something that's lighthearted and wholesome. In this particular episode, Opie was trying to sell his bicycle to a friend of his, and the friend was looking it over to see if it was worth the $5 price tag Opie had put on it. And when Andy came up and found out what was going on, he asked Opie, loud enough for the friend to hear, did you tell him about the brakes that slip sometimes? Did you mention that the inner tube has been patched so many times it doesn't have much life left in it? And And Opie wasn't real happy about his friend who walked away and said, I'm not going to buy that piece of junk because he lost the deal, because his dad exposed all the wrongs. And Andy said, it's not right to do business with a friend and not tell him everything that's wrong with what you're trying to get him to buy. Later in that episode, Andy's trying to sell his house, and they're showing the house to these folks that come by to look at it. And Opie says, did you tell them about the roof that leaks? Did you tell them about the pipes that make the funny noise? Did you tell them about the crack in the ceiling of the kitchen that you painted over so you can't see it? And later, Andy confronts Opie about, you were just mad at me for showing those things about your bicycle. And Opie says, no, same principle. You were supposed to tell what's wrong with the house. And Andy said, houses are houses and bikes are bikes. And it was an empty argument. And of course, by the end of the show, Andy sees the error of his ways. He's been a bad example in front of his boy and asks for forgiveness. And of course, it all works out just fine. It's just kind of one of those where they're watching and seeing, and we have to set a good example and try to live by those examples ourselves. I am the product of quality Christian parents, genuine, sincere, unfeigned faith, like in Lois and Eunice. My grandparents were that way too. Great-grandparents on up the family tree. I am so appreciative of that heritage that we have. Let me close by sharing a couple of things about what the names Lois and Eunice mean. We don't know a lot about them, so we're looking at some meanings of names there. Lois means agreeable or desirable. And I like to take the fact and say that she makes Christianity look agreeable, desirable to her family, to her daughter Eunice, to her daughter Eunice, and then later to her grandson Timothy. And I would pray, that example of spirituality being caught would be that people could look at our life and say, I want to be a Christian because I see that person. I admire that. I would desire that. And so that would make me want to be a Christian. Maybe you've heard it said, I've said it before, that the thing that most influences people to become a Christian is another Christian. And the thing that most convinces people to not become a Christian is another Christian. So be sure you're on the right side of that, and the Christianity that you demonstrate is something that folks would find desirable. Eunice means conquering well. In fact, it comes from the Greek word Nike, like the athletic wear, that means victory. And if you do a good job setting a good Christian example, teaching the values of our faith, teaching about grace and forgiveness, and that is through Jesus that we have our worth and our He forgives us for all of our sins, and His limitless love, unconditional love. If you teach that, then you have accomplished success, victory, and the greatest calling in your life on this side of heaven. So thank you for that. Try to be a Lois and a Eunice to make faith positive and attractive to those who see you, especially in your own family, and that they would be at a place where they would at least know what Christianity represents, what it means to be a follower of Jesus, the grace that saves us, and the discipleship that we can journey into as we go along, so that home and church can work together. I'll close with these two quick things. The church is designed to join hands with the home by God's design. Here's a quote from Reuben Herring that I like. Some things just naturally go together. Ham and eggs, house and lot, horse and carriage, love and marriage. Add another combination, home and church. These two belong together because both are divine institutions. The same God who established the church had already created the family, and when these two God-given institutions fulfill their purpose and function, the land is blessed. Indeed, that is. And, we go back in this study that we've been in, that the very first lady we looked at was Eve. And I say oftentimes in the wedding ceremonies that I have the privilege to officiate, the first group that God put people into. It wasn't a church, and it wasn't a business, and it wasn't government, and it wasn't a system of education. It was the home. it was the home. And Eve's entrance into history was an establishment of the home and the family. It was designed and created by God. And then we find the church established, the dynamic birth of the church on the day of Pentecost that we talked about on Sunday recently took place, again, by the design of the Lord. And so here at the end of this study, we find these ladies, as part of their home, continuing to bear fruit, their investment in the life of young Timothy that brought him to the place to be a faithful and devoted follower of Jesus, a student of Paul, a leader in the early church. So let it be a reminder to us of the importance of church and family, church and home working together. Been a joy to share these lessons with you. I hope you found them meaningful. I have in my preparation and sharing them with you. God bless you. See you soon.